Okay, I'm just going to bring them both out. James Ponsoldt, the director, and our special guest, Jason Segel. Great. Roger said, never step on anyone's applause. So we gift you with the golden thumb, and we already gifted you 2 years ago. So please accept this. You deserved it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
And joining them is Brian Tallerico, the managing editor of RogerEbert.com. And Nate, will you do the honors of moderating? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take it.
What an acting tour de force. It was just incredible. You don't have a microphone.
I'll take this one.
I think you're going to have some recognition come awards time next year. That was just an extraordinary performance.
Thank you very much.
How much of it was you and how much of it was your director?
Well, I tried to just be as honest as possible was all that I could really think to do. I think that, to me, what is so resonant about David Foster Wallace's writing is that he says we're all in this together. And don't you feel like this? You know, there's this thing when you're reading David Foster Wallace, as it's Donald Margulies wrote into the script, where you feel like you're reading about yourself. And so I just really tried to focus on the parts of us that were the same, but the fact that I was even cast in this has everything to do with James Ponsoldt. And the real demand for honesty came from James, so I really attribute the whole thing to James. He brought something out of me I didn't know that I had in me.
And James, I've been calling him Jamie for like 10 years, and now I've got to call him James. Tell us about the casting process.
It was a collaboration between myself, our great casting director, A.V. Kaufman, who I've worked with before, and the producers. And, we just talked about a lot of our favorite actors, and which all of these actors are. And, casting David Foster Wallace is tough. If it was a portrait of him, 10 years earlier, 10 years later, it would be very different. But, I've been a fan of Jason since Freaks and Geeks. It's one of my favorite shows ever. And for me, that was like one of the most beautifully cast teen ensembles ever for me, along with like American Graffiti, Days of Confused, My So-Called Life. Like, it's beautiful. And Jason, for me, was the emotional core of that show. And I've just, I've seen everything he's been in. I've admired him as a writer as well. And, when we met, there were some physical attributes about Jason that were similar to David Foster Wallace, both ex-athletes, things like that. But it was really meeting with him and just listening to him and looking in his eyes so that I sort of, I knew he was that guy. There's, you guys for David Foster Wallace fans, I'm sure there's tons of them here. If you're not, like, you can sort of go onto YouTube. There was a Charlie Rose interview he did in '97, which was a really good frame of reference. I mean, it was a year after the time of this story, but you get a sense of how dynamic, how funny, how engaging, how quick-witted Wallace is. He really has Charlie Rose in the palm of his hand, and there's a lot of things that I think for people that haven't read Wallace and only know that he wrote a very large book and died tragically, they don't understand exactly how funny he was, how much light there was, and that was something I saw in Jason.
Do you consider a departure for you? Did you view this as a risky undertaking as far as your career is concerned?
Well, I think that the goal of all kind of art endeavor is honesty. And so I look back, the first thing that I ever really wrote was Forgetting Sarah Marshall, and that's a comedy, but that was as honest as I knew how to be at the time. I felt like that guy. And so I think that I recognize what James recognized, that there is so much humor in David Foster Wallace's writing that I really related to. But what I really related to more than anything when I read Infinite Jest, I related really hard to this idea that pleasure and achievement and entertainment are not going to satisfy this other feeling you have of not being enough. And I had just finished 10 years on a TV show and doing a ton of interesting things and writing movies, and none of it, I really related because none of it scratched this other feeling of something is missing. And when I read Infinite Jest, I felt like I really understood it for what it meant to me. And so I didn't feel scared to do the movie because I felt like I just really felt like he is a surrogate for this thing that sometimes we don't acknowledge that we all feel, of like, wait, isn't there supposed to be more than this? And so I just, that's a really long answer to, yes, it's a departure.
Brian?
I wonder.
We were going to put more pratfalls in it, but
Yeah. I wonder, you both speak so highly of Wallace, and I know, James, you were a big fan of Wallace, so how do you get past the anxiety that goes with the responsibility of capturing this person who you admired so much? For both of you, as director and actor.
yeah, it's really hard. Infinite Jest came out in March of '96. I started college fall of '97, and I was an English major. And so that winter, I bought a copy of it, and all English majors had it. A lot of people were faking it. People were sort of carrying it with them, and you felt the literal weight of it because it was big, 1,079 pages. And over the course of, I think, 5-6 months, maybe, I finally got through it. And I think it was actually physically, in a way that I think young people now who are just reading things on their Kindle or whatever can't relate to, physically having to engage with that monstrously large book. I felt like an achievement, and then I quickly started reading essays and stories and just tried to devour everything. And a lot of the things going on in that book were really personal to me, things that I was dealing with. And I think, there's definitely sometimes where I think that like his writing kept me alive at times. Even when I got married, my wife and I were debating about what we would have read at our wedding, and the only thing that made sense to me was David Foster Wallace writings. I had it read at our wedding. But I never would have thought to tell a story about David Foster Wallace. I don't like biopics. I don't think of this as a biopic, but cradle to the grave stories that try to reduce a life to 105 minutes just feel so reductive and flattening and just insulting to the complexity of a human life. It was actually my playwriting teacher, Donald Margulies. He had been my playwriting teacher in college. He reached out kind of out of the blue and just said, "Hey, James, I saw that last movie you made, really good, and I don't know if you're a David Foster Wallace fan, but I've adapted this book by a guy named David Lipsky, which I had read, And I've got a script, and Anonymous Content is producing it, and I would love it if you'd read it. Just tell me what you think. And I was terrified to read it. I really wanted it to be bad. Donald's a very good writer. He's won a Pulitzer Prize. I had a feeling in my gut that it might be good, and when I read it, it just moved me to my core, because it didn't try to be anything more than what David Lipsky's book is, which the best parts of it are Wallace's voice at that time, point in his life. Wallace was 34, Lipsky was 30, Jason, as it happens, was 34, Jesse Eisenberg was 30. David Lipsky at that point, I think, was really obsessed with maybe being the smartest guy in the room. He certainly felt insecure around Wallace. And that book, I think, is someone in their mid-40s looking back and wishing they could have done it differently, and probably listening to the tape and realizing that he was being warned by the guy across the table from him that, if the God that you worship is the God of your own intellect, you're going to be left alone. Anyway, I had a lot of fear about it, fear of what the David Foster Wallace fans, who are legion and articulate and on Twitter, what they would think. But, I love the writing of David Foster Wallace has meant as much to me as anything I've ever read. And I would never want to be driven by fear. I was driven totally out of love of the man's writing, and just as much empathy, as I could bring to it. But yeah, there was a lot of trepidation, but I felt like if I didn't do it, I might regret it for the rest of my life.
I mean, films about artists are among the hardest films to get right. And I think what you're saying is that, that was a major challenge, and I think you met it extraordinarily well.
Thank you.
It sort of also gives a whole new meaning to the term bromance.
I mean, there could very well be a story about David Foster Wallace's entire life that would be something very different, that would try to draw conclusions about the end of his life from something that happened to him as a child. I have no interest in seeing that. I certainly wouldn't want to make that. What I can relate to is what it's like to meet someone who you've admired from afar and maybe reveals your own insecurities, who maybe you've measured yourself against, whether that's an artist, whether that's an estranged relative, whatever it is. I think there's something very human and universal in that. And, I think David Lipsky, the character of David Lipsky, is someone that I find a lot of surrogacy with. I wish I was as smart as David Foster Wallace and I could articulate my thoughts on sports and hip-hop and pornography the way he can. I can't, but, I think it's an unrequited love story.
But the other thing that's very difficult is to make a believable film about really smart people. And you've accomplished that as well.
Thank you.
I'm curious if the miniature biopic or this small chapter structure changes your process at all. Like you said, you're not interested in his background or his childhood, but do you have to learn about those kind of things to play him accurately as an actor? How much research into before this period do you do to bring this period to life?
What I thought made sense is a really great question. And what I thought made sense was that I know everything that he would have known up until the point that our story takes place. And felt like anything, I don't know what's going to happen to me tomorrow, and the man I was at 25, if he saw the man I am now, wouldn't recognize him. And so I felt as though what was pertinent to me was what had happened up until that point. So I became pretty well acquainted with that. I also had access to the recordings, to the audio recordings of this week, to Lipsky's recording. So I got to really experience what the tone of the conversation was like. And I think that's the real heartbreak that's captured in the movie, is for a minute, I think David Foster Wallace felt like this might be a friend. Right. This is somebody who is smart and interesting and knows about the same kind of stuff I do, and we're having a good time on this trip, and then all of a sudden there's this sort of sucker punch that happens, and I think it felt like a real betrayal, That's how I played it, at least.
What about the voice?
I had just watched and listened. I had those recordings to listen to. I had the Charlie Rose interviews. What else do I have? You can find interviews here and there on the internet, but what I really did was the answer to the earlier question of, is it scary? It's like incredibly scary. And then it's a lot easier if you don't look at the internet at all. So I stopped.
Good life advice all the time.
No, it's
yeah.
really true. Like, everything's fine if you don't look at the internet. Seriously, try it, and like your day will go fine, and you'll go to sleep, and you'll wake up and eat your food, and everything is totally fine. So, so I did that. And I rented a house outside of Los Angeles where I wasn't surrounded by like billboards and everything like that. And I just sat there and I read, and it made it a much less scary experience. And I just focused on what I was meant to do, and really tried to eliminate anything from my mind of why I couldn't do it or why I shouldn't be the one doing it or any of that stuff. And then I just did it.
Yeah. Good advice. Yeah. Just do it. I'm curious a little bit about how much of it is factually accurate. Is that his house? Was the layout exactly that? And like the research that went into presenting the road and the church and where it takes place?
Yeah. The greatest resource was David Lipsky. Who's a first-rate journalist who was great and totally available, and remarkably had zero vanity. I mean, he could care less how tough we were on him, and I think the film's certainly honest about his agenda. But he was a fierce defender of David Foster Wallace and his memory and the way he talked, the way he would talk to his dogs, things like that. The small things that seem small, maybe to me, were not small in his mind. So he was a great resource, and then there were some people that were very close to David Foster Wallace at this time in his life, who were great resources. I went to Bloomington Normal. I had some very kind folks who are actually thanked in the credits who showed me where he worked, showed me where he lived, showed me where he ate, all of that. I could certainly relate. I'm from a college town in a kind of rural area. So there was that. The film itself was not shot there for really dumb film reasons having to do with tax incentives. We shot, I'm sorry, in Michigan, with a day in Minneapolis and a day in New York, and I wish like hell we could have shot in Illinois. That would have been amazing. Yeah.
Like the governor or whoever's in charge of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Bloomington, this audience received as a bit of a joke.
Yeah. It's never played that way before. That was so great. It was way funnier than we thought.
But, the character says it, this is a very American story. And I don't think you can find any place more American than Bloomington, Illinois.
Yeah, except for some time, in Massachusetts and Arizona, and then at the end of his life, California. For the most part of his life, David Foster Wallace spent his time in where we are now, this part of Illinois. So it really shaped everything about him.
And he went to Urbana High School, which is
Class of 1980, I believe.
Yeah. I think Roger was the class of 1960. I was the class of 1962. So
there you go.
There's something strange about Urbana High School.
Something in the water.
And I actually got an email from the superintendent of schools in Urbana, Illinois, when he heard that we were going to be showing this film here. So I don't know if he's here, but he sent a very nice email.
Cool.
James, your films seem to me to be about life-changing chance encounters. Two people who meet and for whatever reason change each other's lives forever from that point on. At least Lipsky in this case, maybe not Wallace. And that's certainly true in Spectacular Now and Smashed and how those people define each other. I wonder why that's something that interests you, or if it's something that you've noticed as a pattern in what you're drawn to, or were you drawn to in other cinema as well?
I can say in the case of this film, sort of as I mentioned before, I think it's hard to relate to or ask an audience to relate to the experience of what it is to be a genius, or what it is to wrestle with major depression if they haven't themselves, or alcoholism, or anything. But coming in contact with someone who brings out the best and maybe the worst in you, I think we've all had that experience. This sounds really hoity-toity, but there's my father, when I was pretty young, too young to appreciate it, gave me an old copy of Dubliners by James Joyce, and there was a note on the back of it that he just described all of those short stories as being about epiphanies, which I think are just this tiny internal change that probably would not register to anyone who is even in close proximity to that person, but hopefully maybe it's some shift in your consciousness that demands that you try to change your life, hopefully for the better. I think I like seeing stories about fucked up people trying to be better to themselves and to the people around them.
That's good.
I was thinking as I was watching the film, does this work if it's not David Foster Wallace? Is it if it's just a writer, a fictionalized situation? I'll tell you what I think, but I'd like to ask what you guys think.
I certainly hope so. I mean, that was always the goal. If this was just inside-based, if I had to say to everybody, well, Shipping Out was an essay that he wrote, and then it was retitled. If I had to explain that, that would be so pretentious, and it would be so antithetical to the values that I have as a storyteller. Hopefully, it's totally universal, totally relatable, and my hope is that if anything, it just inspires some people to go read David Foster Wallace and David Lipsky. If you want to understand David Foster Wallace better, read his writing, buy his books. That's the best thing you could do.
Well, I think that it's a very universal story, and I think that there is some idea that any of us could be in that car. But I think that the reason that it has to be David Foster Wallace is because he really uniquely captured a way that we all feel, I think, and was able to articulate it. That's the difference, and that's what made David Foster Wallace so special, is I think that there are these feelings that are swirling around in us, and he put them perfectly into words. And so that's the only reason I think it needs to be specifically him, because it honors what I think is a really, really unique and very, very special ability to act as a surrogate for all of us in a really poignant way.
Well, I think that's what you did in this film for us.
Thank you.
Because from the very beginning, the relationship that develops between the two characters is instantly believable. It's interesting. You're saying smart things. Underneath the surface, there is this, the idea of the interview. It's a very artificial situation that you're thrown into, and it makes you very self-reflexive and probably in ways that you don't necessarily like. And that came across very, very well in the performances. So.
Thank you.
Brian, you have any more questions before we throw it open to the audience?
I think we can throw it open.
Yeah.
Let's get some questions from the audience. There are microphones. Raise your hand, and the microphone will come to you, we hope.
I got a question to your right up front.
Hi, Jason. I was just curious, when there's a well-known actor playing a well-known actual real-life person, one of my biggest worries is often, as a viewer, is that I'm going to look up on screen and I'm going to just say, this is Jason Segel playing David Foster Wallace, instead of saying, this is David Foster Wallace. Is that something you're conscious of? And as far as I know, this is the first time you've played a role of a real-life person, so was the approach a little bit different than playing a fictional role?
Well, my only recourse is to not think about it, I think, when I'm doing it, and then just hope for the best, because I was afraid of the same thing going into the first screening at Sundance, whereas the first time I saw it with an actual big audience, and I thought, there is a chance, no matter how well I did, that like an organ being rejected, the audience just like, nope. And then there's nothing I can do about it. And so I just tried to do the best job that I could. And the other thing I tried to really do was I tried not to do too much acting, if that makes a lot of sense. I think that what I really had an instinct of was that you'd be able to sniff out, like, watch Jason Segel try acting. You know? And so I tried that was something I was conscious of like, not to try anything flashy. And I think that worked out, you know, well. But that was what, I think that would have been the big pitfall, is like, watch me try to do a big speech or something like that. Yeah, it was just so beautifully written and so beautifully directed, it wasn't an option, so I got lucky.
What about wearing that bandana all the time?
It was great. I really liked it. I didn't have the courage to like wear it around people I knew before we started shooting. Which honestly, like, this is part of why I rented a place outside of LA. It was so I could go around in a bandana with impunity. And
chew tobacco?
yeah, I did. Actually, I did. I had a book club, a bunch of guys in a book club who I read Infinite Jest with, and then they taught me how to chew tobacco also. So it was great.
You didn't stain the bandana, did you?
No, bandana's intact.
Another question?
To your left on stage.
Where?
Extreme left.
Hi. Okay, I guess this is a question for both of you. James, when directing this film, what did you find to be probably one of the more challenging things you had to do? And then Jason, for you, when portraying David Foster Wallace, what was one of the more challenging things you had to do as well?
Great question. I mean, there was a lot that was challenging. I think just trying to be present and respect the work that they were doing and try to just have an emotional response and just have an acute BS detector. And if something wasn't going right, trying to fix it, but also if I did not know how to fix it, but it didn't feel right, just having my ego in check enough to say to Jason and Jesse or whomever, I don't think this is going right. Help me fix it. Not being afraid to look like a fool. That was a big thing. Besides that, we shot during the polar vortex. It was well below zero most of the time. That really sucked. I'm from the South.
The other thing, I don't know if it's challenging. It just was what it was. But we didn't have any kind of budget or luxury to shoot in order or anything like that. So we shot by location. The first location we shot in, day one, was the house. And we shot in the house for 3 days. And that was the end. That was when we came back and have the big argument, and then I come back into his room, all that stuff, and the whole end of the movie, we shot on day 2. So yeah, that was bad.
Another question?
From the balcony to your right.
Hi. In the book Infinite Jest, there are a lot of ideas about film and television and how it can corrupt someone's mind. I think one of my favorite parts in the book is about the guy who gets addicted to watching MASH. And I was just wondering, like, you guys made a film, and it's a great film, but it's a film. I was wondering how that affected you guys while making the film.
I'll go for this one. Well, my personal take on the message of Infinite Jest is this idea of using entertainment to numb yourself, and especially when that entertainment is being provided by advertisers, where the real goal is to sell you stuff. And in a very similar part of that book, he says that advertising is creating an anxiety relieved by purchase, which I thought it was just so beautiful and brilliant. So I think it's a different kind of entertainment. It's the entertainment where you sit and you watch a marathon of a reality show, and the commercials are coming on and selling you things you don't need and making you feel like your dishwasher's not good enough and that the new dishwasher is gonna fix everything. I think it's that is the commentary on entertainment. I like to think something like this, you leave the theater and you talk to your fellow man and you think a little bit. So I hope it's actually in the good category of entertainment.
Jamie?
Well, I don't know. I think about Roger Ebert a little bit, and sort of how my taste as a film goer developed from reading his reviews and seeing movies that he recommended, and it inherently informed, how I told stories. And I think it was some urge towards humanism and a generosity of spirit and being honest. And calling out stuff that had artifice or cruelty or a lack of empathy and, the necessary targets. Roger Ebert could be vicious towards bad entertainment in a way that was profoundly entertaining. So could David Foster Wallace. Speaking only for myself, I tried to make the film that, if I saw it when I was 18, which is when I first read Infinite Jest, or when I saw it when I was 25 or 30, when I really needed his writing, that would have been meaningful to me. And if that was what I aimed for, and hopefully it's resonant in some way to some other people as well.
How surprised are you that this film actually got made? Because there aren't a whole lot of stereotypical commercial elements in it.
I'm surprised. No, stories about writers, right, are just paint drying, right? It was sort of, trying to get it financed. It depends on the film, right? When you hear it's a story about a writer, people assume it's someone sitting at a typewriter for 2 hours or something. Depending on the financier I was talking to, I would describe it very differently. Some of my favorite films, whether it's The Trip or With Nail and I or My Dinner with Andre, I did not mention to people who were putting money on the line. I think I mentioned Sideways and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. But I also like those movies as well. I tried to be honest in how we represented it, but sometimes I'm surprised, but our financier is very happy with how it turned out, for what it's worth.
But you managed to get films made that are not obvious commercial films, and I think each film you do is exponentially better than the one you did before, and you've only done 4 films, so we expect really, really great things from you.
Thank you. Or I can quote David Foster Wallace from this movie, it's all downhill from here. Yeah. I will not be seeing you in 2 years, the next one will suck.
2 years ago, you brought us Shailene Woodley. This year, you're bringing us Jason Segel. Who are you going to bring us in 2 years?
I had a way with the dogs, I think. Maybe I'll just go into, dog food commercials. I'll bring a really talented Doberman or something. I don't know.
That was the other thing that was difficult, to answer your question again, is all the scenes with the dogs. I had to do very serious acting with salmon in my pants.
Is that a euphemism, or?
No, that's a fact. That's a fact. I was doing acting, pants full of salmon.
And Jesse had salmon on his neck in the bed. Yeah. Peanut butter. Was it peanut butter and salmon? Salmon.
Yeah. Salmon is native to Bloomington, Illinois.
Yeah, exactly. Good Illinois salmon, yeah.
Another question?
Oh, we got a question to your far right over here.
What's that?
I have a comment and a question. The comment being that the cinematography was absolutely gorgeous. From the very beginning, it was very restless, very crass, and the voyeurism was so awesome to the point where I really wanted to kind of turn either Jesse or Jason's shoulders to kind of see more of their face. My question being, and this is for both of you, what can you say about a scene, setting it up and filming it, where it really relies on just 2 actors going back and forth, falling off of each other?
That's great. Well, we had to the first part, we had a really phenomenal cinematographer, a Swedish cinematographer named Jakob Iri, who works with a filmmaker named Joachim Trier, who I think has had a film here.
Yeah, Joachim has been here with Oslo,
and
August.
And Reprise as well, and has a film that's going to be at Cannes. Is a phenomenal filmmaker. It was, I think what I loved about those films and what Jakob brings to things is there's a level of naturalism. He finds beauty in actual natural light. There wasn't a desire to overlight things. And, I think sometimes when it's just two people talking, sometimes there can be a weird anxiety in one's gut as a director that you have to, do more things, somehow make it sexy or exciting, or things that I trusted deeply when I read the script, when we were planning it, could get wildly insecure and nervous about on set, and I had to remind myself what we were making and really just watch and listen. And this was the film that I wanted to make. I mean, I could, there's a in the D.A. Pennebaker doc, Don't Look Back. There's a clip. I think it's either in the finished version or maybe it was an outtake. It's on YouTube though, and it's Bob Dylan, that when he's like this young king. And the clip that I found on YouTube was it's him and John Lennon in the backseat of a limo. And in every other circumstance, Bob Dylan is the center of the universe, and everyone's blowing so much smoke up his, and he's being a jerk to Donovan and other people. But in this case, it's John Lennon is just being so funny and making all these jokes. And you see Dylan just looking at him like a little kid, trying to make him laugh, and Lennon's kind of impenetrable. And it's so weird to see sort of the moon and the earth sort of change places. And I was, watching that clip over and over, I was like, there is no car ride ever that I would rather be in than that. If I could know what it was like to be there, to know what the world was feeding them, how they were sort of processing it, that would be amazing. And that's really what I wanted this film to feel like. Like, these were just two guys talking about the regular stuff of life that I talk about with my friends, and I just wanted to make it so that I desperately wanted to hang out with them as a viewer.
Yeah, I mean, Roger would always talk about observational films, and I think this film falls into that category.
Were there any other films that you used thematically or formically to craft this one, or that you kept in mind?
Yeah, some of the ones I mentioned, With Nail and I is one that I love. A movie called The Hours and Times, which is about a hypothetical speculation into a weekend that John Lennon might have spent with Brian Epstein. It's a pretty amazing film. Good Night and Good Luck, Social Network, some of the other ones I mentioned. But
just occurred to me. Tell us about Joan Cusack.
Yeah, Joan Cusack is a unicorn. She's I adore her. I grew up watching her, loved her, found her to just be one of the great film clowns there are. And then about a year and a half ago, I directed an episode of Shameless, which takes place on the west side of Chicago. And they shoot it in LA and Chicago. And Joan lives in Chicago with her husband and kids, and has a very wonderfully, compellingly normal life, and I got to know her through that show. And afterwards, I was just like, please, let's stay in touch. I just want to put you in everything. And I did. As soon as I knew that we had money for this, I was like, come be in this movie, come be in this movie, come be in this movie. She's great. She is exactly as you would think. She's completely authentic to herself. One of the funniest people I've ever met. And there's nobody like her.
I mean, she looks so different than she did in Shameless. I mean, it's
When we were about to wrap the film, my wife and I had our first son. We have one son, but our son was born about 3 weeks after we finished shooting, and she was obsessed with this fact. And when it was her last day, when we were breaking for lunch, Joan came to me and she said, "James, I have something for you." And it was this piece of paper with all these buttons on it. And she had gotten it at an antique store driving up from Chicago. And I was like, what is this? And she said, it's just buttons for your son. One day he'll need buttons. And I was like, he will need buttons. Thank you very much. And then I gave her a big hug. That's Joan Cusack. She gave me buttons I didn't even know that I needed yet, or that my future son would need.
Do you still have these buttons?
Oh God, yes, it's great. No, it's in his nursery.
So, I mean, I know a little bit about babies. Babies are snaps and zippers. They're not buttons.
Yeah, no, babies eat buttons. Babies should be nowhere near buttons, but it's on the wall.
We have time for one or two more questions.
To your left. To your left.
I really like the movie, Forgetting Sarah Marshall. It was just so completely emotional.
Oh, thanks.
And I mean, there's so many people that can actually identify with that movie because of the fact that so many people, because I actually live in Hawaii.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I've been like heartbroken over some women in my life. And so I can
depression and everything. And in this movie that you're
Can you
in-
turn on his microphone in the front?
Well, in this movie that you're in is dealing with some depression, and I've dealt personally, don't want to admit, I've dealt with a lot of depression in my life and a lot of anxiety and everything else, and and I've had friends that have committed suicide. Not that I would. I always think if I can make it through the day, that's great. But anyway, I just want to say that your movies are just extraordinary, and I even saw the movie, I think it's called My Brother Jeff or something.
Jeff Who Lives at Home, yeah.
Jeff, and that was like very, very personal. I mean, it's like, they're all so personal.
Thanks.
And I mean, are these from your own personal life's experiences that you actually, are acting on pulling in your own personal experiences of life, like especially like the heartbreak in Forgetting Sarah Marshall?
Yeah, well, I think, I really think that the best thing you can do is try to find the parts of us that are all the same when you're acting versus the parts of you that, that are different or special. I think we're all really similar. It's a belief that I have is that we're all basically the same with different upbringings and a sort of a different set of circumstances, but I really do think everyone feels the same. And so I just try to focus on that, I think.
I just want to say one last thing. In Hawaii, I had some Japanese girls come up to me and they go, Jason Segel to me. I don't even look like him. I guess it's like how Japanese all look kind of alike to us. And they think that I was Jason Segel. I go, no, I'm not Jason Segel. They say, can I get a good autograph? I said, no. But they wanted to sashimi. So I felt like it was an insult to Jason Segel. It wasn't good looking.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
We get the point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. One final question.
To your left. To your left.
Okay.
Hello. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the film, and I wanted to thank you for bringing it for all of us. And then our last director said that in making his film, Moving Midway, he didn't realize what a film was until he was done with it. He said that it's not what's in the can that's a film. It's not until you show it to somebody, until you see how they're going to react, or to audiences like this. So I was just wondering, was there a scene that you thought would play funny that actually comes across serious, or was there one that was serious that ends up getting a good laugh?
That's a great question. My favorite scenes in it are definitely sort of hangout or observational scenes that where there's nothing big or histrionic. I mean, the opening, it's a very long scene. The first night that they are at Wallace's house, where he just puts on Murmur, an REM album, and they just sort of, talk about relationships and talk about Alanis Morissette and all these things, and it sort of rides this wave of flirtation, of a platonic sort, and two guys testing each other, genuinely maybe liking each other, there being genuine tension at maybe overstepping boundaries, because really they're not friends, they're complete strangers who spent a few days together. That's what they were. I think that just had emotions in it that I wasn't totally aware of. I think a lot of them were on the page, and many of them, if not most of them, came from Jason and Jesse, who just brought so much depth and messy humanity to it.
Jason, yeah, were there any scenes that you were worried about playing opposite from the intended?
No, I felt like the same scene that James is talking about was one of the key scenes in the movie, because that's, I think, as an audience, if I try to imagine, that's where you decide if you are interested in watching these two people have their relationship. And if you're not interested at that point, nothing happens beyond that to make you more interested. I mean, do you know what I mean? That's sort of like, do you want to watch these guys get to know each other, or don't you? And so I felt like going into that scene, when we went in to shoot, that it was very important that it sort of be a microcosm of everything that the movie is about. That it's fun, that these guys have some sort of they're both really good at pop culture, but there are things that David Foster Wallace does not want to broach with him. So I really felt like that was a really, really important scene. And then the other scene I thought that was really important that's so little is the scene where David Lipsky comes and knocks on the door to get him from the hotel. It's a very small scene, and David Foster Wallace has been awake all night watching TV, because I felt like that's the only scene where you see David Foster Wallace succumb to his TV addiction. And I thought that was a very, very important scene.
Yeah, he fell off the wagon.
He fell off. In my opinion, the way I chose to play it is that is a scene where he fell off the wagon of his television addiction.
We haven't even touched on talking about the music, but do you want to say a few quick words about that? Because I know music's very important to you.
Yeah. Do you mean all of the score and the source music, or I was really lucky. I mean, I work. I'm a music obsessive. I started writing about music for like alt weeklies in Athens, Flagpole, which when I was 15, 16, started getting to interview a lot of my heroes, and then when I was in college, I interned at Rolling Stone, thought I might want to work there, and decided I definitely did not want to work there. So I always do think about music, but I also work with a great music supervisor named Tiffany Anders, and we were really interested in both the music that they would have chosen to listen to and the music that just would have been available in public spaces and on corporate radio at the time, and finding real pleasure in that, and not just being total music snobs about it, and not just playing the music of 1995 and 1996 as though it's the only music that exists in the world, but also playing some of the 80s, the 70s, the 60s. So it's a lot of my favorite music, and a lot of our cues came from what they actually did love. I mean, the Brian Eno song that plays at the end, Big Ship, is one of my favorite songs. It was certainly one of David Foster Wallace's. There's REM in the film, throughout the film. That was something that they both loved. And then I was very lucky to work with Danny Elfman, who did the score for the movie. And usually, I didn't know what a composer was until I knew who Danny Elfman was. But from The Simpsons and Tim Burton movies when I was a kid. And it's certainly very different score than this. But the past couple of years, he's been working with Gus Van Sant and David O. Russell. And, this is much more minimalist than what he usually does. But he's a real artist and challenged me and was a wonderful collaborator.
Well, listen, thanks to both of you for
thank you
for coming to visit. We really
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.